Wonderful. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Wow. I really appreciate that. I appreciate the introduction. It did not mention that I once was a syndicated radio personality, so I am terrified in front of a live audience, let alone video. I didn't do the telegenic thing. We radio people like to hide behind the screen, so on. I am thrilled to be here not only at Duke University because my wife and daughter went to Duke. I was forced to go to the Duke of the North in New Haven. And that's what times change. But I am quite seriously thrilled and honored to be the Lynn W. Distinguished 2014 Lecturer. The people who have given this lecture before are thoroughly intimidating to today's speaker. They include Roderick Nash and Bill Cronin and Char Miller and many others who are distinguished in this field. As Jamie said, I combine a rather unusual background in scholarship and mostly running national advocacy organizations to try to fix the problems that we study and learn in history. So I am here today with a dual purpose, not only to be broadcast and streamed around the world and go viral. This is my moment, right? But to explore with you the history of women in the environment and some major figures that I can only touch upon a little bit while we're here in our time. And also, frankly, I am looking, and I go to college campuses to find a new generation of leaders to help us solve the problems that we face. Those of us who are more senior will be with you as long as we can in this struggle. We've gone through a difficult election, to be blunt, in terms of environmental candidates, and that includes North Carolina. And I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill and with organizations trying to deal with that. So I hope you will listen and learn. I hope you will get engaged. Later, because I'm underneath it all an old organizer, I have a sign-up sheet for, actually this is called a pen for young people. And you grasp it between, anyhow. It's an email activist sign-up if you're at all interested. And I met with some students, both master's and PhD students, at lunch. It was great fun, and you were deeply engaged, and I am thrilled to be here with you all again, and those of you who are, for the first time, I'm meeting, as well as the folks from the Forest History Society. As we say in Washington, I yield the remainder of my time. That was all warm-up, so don't count it against me. And afterwards, I do hope you will take a look at the book, which also helps to support the Rachel Carson Council. And now, for my official self. I want to tell you my title, as you can see broadcast worldwide before and after Rachel Carson, Women in the Environmental Movement, from Forests to Fracking. And I think I wanted to weave in some themes out of my book around forests, Jamie, because that's why we're partly here. So let me begin with my first real advertisement. Thank you about the book. But the reason I got involved with the Rachel Carson Council had to do with the photograph on this book. I wanted to use what it was an iconic photograph of Rachel Carson sitting atop, for those of you from Pennsylvania will recognize that this is Hawk Mountain, where 20,000 to 30,000 raptors come over every fall. 15 years before, there would have been photos of men with mustaches and floppy hats and long guns killing 25,000 to 30,000 raptors coming across. But another woman who we can't talk about today, Rosalie Edge, helped to save that area. But I picked this photo because it is an icon of the great woman at the mountaintop. Many great leaders have been to the mountaintop, from Moses to Martin to Rachel Carson. But it's a misleading image, and that's partly the reason I wrote this book, to try to put Rachel and her sisters who came before her and after in the context of a movement, of reaching out and working with people around the country and now around the world to try to solve these problems, not simply to write and think, research, and do the beautiful prose that Rachel is also known for. And so if she sits alone on this rock outcrop atop Hawk Mountain with her binoculars, I said it's a striking photo. It's her alone in an Olympian pose far above the fields and farms of Pennsylvania down below. But like many photos, this one is as important, I think, for what it leaves out as well as for the picture of Rachel. Rachel was not alone on that mountaintop. This picture, or image of her, was taken by a woman, Rachel's close friend and colleague, a woman named Shirley Briggs. And when Rachel died of breast cancer in April of 1964, her work was not yet done, and Shirley Briggs carried it forward. She wrote an important book on pesticides. She founded what is now the Rachel Carson Council. You'll also notice that Rachel is using binoculars. I'm going to tell you a little bit that she's using those binoculars instead of a gun because of another woman, Florence Merriam Bailey, who you all have studied, I'm sure. The nation's first campus environmental organizer at Smith College in 1886, and she wrote a book called Birds Through an Opera Glass that set off the craze of birding with binoculars that Rachel and her friends were obsessed with, as am I. So Rachel is only the most visible peak of a whole range of women who came before her and who carry on today. So we think of Rachel Carson as the mother of modern environmentalism, yet her work is as close to the 19th century as it is to our time. Rachel was born on May 27th, 1907. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her sister and brother, Merriam and Robert Jr., up there, were already in the 5th and 1st grades. And her father, Papa, was often absent trying to sell insurance. So it was Rachel's mother, Maria, who was forced to resign her teaching job, as was the custom then when she married. No single mom, no kids, nothing, just married, you're out. Maria McLean Carson was well educated for her day. She attended the excellent Washington Female Seminary near Pittsburgh, and she poured all of her learning and her desires into her youngest and frankly favorite child, Rachel, who's there reading to her dog at an early age. So Maria went to Washington Female Seminary. She graduated in 1887 with honors in Latin, studied a range of classical subjects that included science, took advanced courses at nearby Washington College. They're adjacent. It, of course, was only for men, but she was so good they allowed her to take a couple of courses over at Washington College. But it was Maria who passed on her values, including those from her own independent and educated mother, Rachel McLean, who was the studious daughter of a Presbyterian minister. So Maria McLean Carson instilled in Rachel a love of learning, an emotional identification with birds and nature, and a penchant for careful observation and scientific method. She also groomed her to become a writer. As Maria studied nature and the birds on her walks with little Rachel around the house and in the woods, she helped her with her first childhood booklets and stories and encouraged her to submit her work to the children's section of St. Nicholas magazine, where Rachel won her first writing prize at age 11. In 1918, this is the May issue. When Rachel entered the contest, she won in September. So Maria, her mom, passing these things on, was already drawing on a half-century of work and influence arduously accumulated by a long line of women naturalists, writers, educators, conservationists who had come before. St. Nicholas magazine often featured pieces about nature by extremely popular writers like Florence Merriam Bailey. The natural science lessons, the instructions that the Marion and Robert, her siblings, brought home from school were used by Maria to train and educate Rachel at an early age. It was a widely used school curriculum. It was produced by one Anna Botsford Comstock. first female professor at Cornell, a leader in the nature study movement, and author of the popular Handbook of Nature Study, which was part of a broad movement led by women that reached out across the country to try to interest people all over the country in studying nature, which they believed, of course, would lead to feeling, caring, and working on behalf of others, as well as knowing about nature. So all of these women are part of a larger network of female authors, advocates, artists. So as the 19th century progressed, as you know, women began to gain better educations, the ability to travel and write, especially those in the more privileged classes. They hiked, explored, botanized, birded, observed the steady encroachment of industry and urban life upon the countryside, and they began to write professionally. So imagine that denied access to the heights of academia, the professions, publishing, restricted still by gender, they nevertheless churned out diaries, journals, novels, children's stories, and books, wrote for magazines, published best-selling books, fiction and nonfiction about nature. And as these women wrote, many also organized and advocated for the protection of wildlife, wilderness, and a vanishing way of life. So by the time of President Teddy Roosevelt, there was already a rich network of women's organizations, local groups, magazines, editors, authors, their combination of engaged and imaginative writing, moral values, calls to action, and writing for popular and youthful audiences led over time to a disregard for such female environmental leaders. They've been seen as sentimental, Victorian, overly moralistic, and too much given to anecdote over hard-boiled analysis and academic rigor. But their writing and their lives, their influence and cultural legacy led Rachel Carson to cherish science and narrative, imagination and wonder, the power of stories and words, and the need to take principled action. So our story begins in upstate New York in 1850. Often I quiz audiences, but we don't have time. That is Susan Fenimore Cooper, 1850. Even as a guy named Henry David Thoreau labored obscurely, America's first popular nature writer was being hailed by critics and common folk alike. Susan Fenimore Cooper was the devoted daughter of the famed American author James Fenimore Cooper, but she published Rural Hours in 1850. It was an immediate success, preceded Walden by 4 years. We know Thoreau himself read Rural Hours at least 2 years before Walden ever began. He records in his journal of 1852, while commenting upon a newspaper account of loons diving to a depth of 80 feet, and he says, "Miss Cooper has said the same." And if mostly forgotten now, Susan Cooper was as influential in her time as Rachel Carson is in ours. Rural Hours went through 4 decades of popular publication, revision in the United States and overseas. After only 6 weeks, this is my goal, of brisk American sales, the publisher, George P. Putnam, was planning a fine edition. Susan's novelist father was stopped in the streets of New York with congratulations, as he said, 12 times a day. And William Cullen Bryant, the leading poet and editor of the day, called Rural Hours one of the sweetest books ever written. So in 1887, as Maria McLean Carson was graduating from Washington Female Seminary, the last shortened and updated revised edition of Rural Hours was put out by Houghton Mifflin. It was followed by several essays by Cooper in 1893 that lament the decline of birds, their slaughter by the millinery trade for women's hats, and the shift away from a more natural, small-town life. Then in 1894, the year of her death, 81-year-old Susan Cooper's final piece, a children's story, is published in St. Nicholas magazine. But Rural Hours and the essays of Susan Fenimore Cooper dropped out of print and out of favor. But if we look at them with fresh eyes, Rural Hours is a remarkable document. It's a personal journal of the progression of the seasons day by day in upstate New York with a wealth of detail and interesting descriptions of small town life, sadly declining Oneida Indians, and countless species of trees, birds, flowers, precise weather observations. And although Susan describes, she also decries. She laments the heedless destruction of woods and forests for profit. It is not surprising, perhaps, that a man whose chief object in life is to make money should turn his timber into banknotes with all possible speed. But Cooper is not merely an elitist, immune to the needs of a growing society. Like many of our early women writers and scientists, she's also deeply engaged in caring for her community. Upon her death in 1894, she was as beloved in Cooperstown for her concern with the poor as she was for her writing about nature. She started a free school for local underprivileged children, was involved in the charity house that provided shelter for poverty-stricken families, helped establish a Thanksgiving hospital after the Civil War, which is now the Thanksgiving home for the elderly in Cooperstown, and was most engrossed by the great work of her life, the orphan house of the Holy Savior, familiarly known as the orphanage. It is such compassion and caring for her neighbors, growing out of strong religious faith, that also infuses Susan's concern for rural America, its changing values, economy, and landscape. I think when such moral values are blended with skillful writing, her readers are moved to an emotionally felt, scientifically based concern for our civic and natural surroundings. Consider Susan's approach to life, the environment, and the economy. Of old-growth forest pines, she could wax lyrical. And yet, in their rudest shapes, they are never harsh. As we approach them, we shall always find something of the calm of age and the sweetness of nature to soften their aspect. There is a grace in the slow waving of their limbs in the higher air which never fails. There is a mysterious melody in their breezy murmurs. There is an emerald light in their beautiful verdure, which lies in unfading wreaths, fresh and clear, about the heads of those old trees. She can also highlight important botanical characteristics. The long brown cones are chiefly pendulous, in clusters from the upper branches, their girth from 5 or 6 to 12 feet, and in height from 100 to 126 feet. Or Susan Cooper can be angrily dismissive of those who destroy and exploit such trees. It needs but a few short minutes to bring one of these trees to the ground. The rudest boor passing along the highway may easily do the deed, but how many years must pass ere its equal stands on the same spot? Cooper goes on to say her town might even pass away before such old-growth trees can be replaced. In fact, no other younger wood can ever claim the same connection as this with a state of things now passed away forever. They cannot have that wild, stern character of the aged forest pines. But like Rachel Carson and others who followed her, Susan Cooper is a practical, politically shrewd, worldly woman who makes pragmatic economic arguments as well. They foreshadow today's cost-effectiveness arguments for the value of ecosystem services. She writes, "It has been calculated that 60,000 acres of pine woods are cut every year in our state alone. But unaccountable as it may appear, few American farmers are aware of the full value and importance of wood. They seem to forget the relative value of forests." Cooper even adds their worth to civilization, their aesthetic and shade value, their general improvement of the quality of life. Again, she's eminently practical. How easy it would be to improve most of the farms in the country by a little attention to the woods and trees, improving their appearance and adding to their market value at the same time. Thinning woods and not blasting them, clearing only such ground as is marked for immediate tillage, preserving the wood on the hilltops and rough side hills, encouraging a coppice on this or that knoll, permitting bushes and young trees to grow at will along the brooks and water courses. Later in her career, Susan Cooper, foreshadowing Rachel Carson, focuses her attention on robins, as in Silent Spring. She had celebrated them in Rural Hours, and then with a series of articles that mark her emergence as what the historian Madeline Holmes has called a literary ornithologist, she wrote in Appleton's Journal in 1878 Otsego Leaves 1, 2, and 3. They carefully describe the yearly nesting of robin families under her eaves, as well as decry the growing slaughter of birds for the millinery trade. In the nearly 3 decades since Rural Hours had appeared, Susan Fenimore Cooper has become a distinguished public figure. She now speaks out against the growing destruction of the environment and of birds that are only hinted at in her first work. By 1893, she writes A Lament for the Birds in the New Harper's Weekly, one of the most popular magazines of its time. She notes the decline of various species, including the passenger pigeon, soon to fall extinct. Then, at the time of her death at 81, Susan Cooper's last piece appears. It's that 1894 children's story in St. Nicholas Magazine. It's quite likely, given her interest in nature study and her subscription to St. Nicholas before Rachel was born, that Maria Carson was well aware of Susan Cooper and her final warnings of environmental destruction. Pause for vodka. So Susan Cooper lived and wrote in rural upstate New York, and she was in effect one of the earliest practitioners of field work. But this woman is her younger, more urban contemporary, one Graceanna Lewis, one of my favorites. She was the first woman to penetrate the male world of official ornithology and the careful study of collected specimens in a scientific institute, the prestigious Academy of Sciences in Philadelphia. She was also the first to publish a recognized work of ornithology, the initial volume of a planned multi-volume work called The Natural History of Birds. But Graceanna also showed the 19th century female naturalist penchant for broad interdisciplinary study and observation. She painted, wrote poetry, was an expert on trees, and became an early proponent of nature study. So we, and I, can only regret that Graceanna Lewis never was able to finish her planned multi-volume magnus opus. The famed ornithologist John Casson of Casson's Finch, his mentoring of his brilliant female fellow Quaker at the Academy of Natural Sciences was quite unorthodox. And so when he died in 1869, Graceanna was never again as welcome in the male world of the Academy. In 1870-71, she returned to teaching at a nearby friend's school. She did, however, lecture more and more widely on birds and other naturalist subjects while remaining active in social causes, including the abolition movement. She ran a station on the Underground Railroad and was active in the growing clamor for women's rights. Thus, Graceanna's first real national prominence came when she spoke at the Third Congress of Women, held in October 1875 in Syracuse, New York. Graceanna received support from other women as well. Her Vassar teacher, friend, and mentor, the famed astronomer Maria Mitchell, enthusiastically recommended Graceanna for a post at the college. But despite her superb qualifications, she was turned down. As Graceanna noted straightforwardly in a letter to her sister, because of the preference for a masculine representative in that chair. So, blocked from an academic post, Grace Anna turned fully to popularizing science through lectures and reached wide national audiences. She was a major draw for the Women's Pavilion here at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. She earned praise from the judges for her interesting and important work. She also won a medal at the 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exhibition for her collection of 50 watercolors of Pennsylvania tree leaves. Proficient in ornithology, the study of algae, dendrology, scientific painting, and published widely in journals and magazines, Grace Anna Lewis remained active despite never receiving a permanent college, university, or government post. She was influential in the widespread dissemination of nature studies as a social reformer, interested in the advancement of women. She was active in the American Association for the Advancement of Women. She worked to have professorships open to women and encouraged young female medical students, worked for women's suffrage, and was involved in the Women's Christian Temperance movement, which introduced the study of physiology and hygiene in schools to provide scientific underpinning for and training about the dangers of narcotics and alcohol. Excuse me. So by the time of Rachel Carson's youth, a direct influence on her is the famous Florence Merriam Bailey. She was the first college environmental organizer, so I want you to pay careful attention. And one of the leading female nature writers and advocates of the early 20th century. She was born in upstate New York, the daughter of Clinton Merriam, a wealthy businessman and congressman who retired early at age 40 and built a wooded estate called Homewood. Florence's brother, C. Hart Merriam, became the head of the U.S. Biological Survey and a confidant of Theodore Roosevelt. But as with Rachel Carson, it was Florence's mother, Carolyn, a highly educated woman without professional career opportunities, who turned her attention to the education of her children, Hart and Florence. Carolyn introduced Florence and her brother to astronomy from the roof of Homewood, to nature and bird study in the grounds and woods around their home. Both children were also tutored by their aunt, Helen Bagg, who lived nearby. She was an amateur botanist, introduced them to wildflowers and other plants from the woods and to her herbarium, and even taught them taxidermy. Thus encouraged young Hart avidly shot and stuffed specimens. By age 14, Hart Merriam was a leading young ornithologist with the largest collection of skins in the country. However, his collection of stuffed specimens contained in a special 3-story building that his father had built for him at Homewood so repelled Florence. She was so horrified that she quickly developed a taste for observing live birds and animals. And so she carried seeds on her daily walks and tried to attract and bring down the birds to her hand. And they'd come in and she would look and study them without shooting, stuffing, and mounting them. And so at Smith College, Florence showed her talent for writing, nature study, and organizing. The then new women's college did not have a full science major, so Florence became steeped in literature, religion, philosophy, and the arts. During college, her brother Hart advanced in the male scientific world, became a member of the American Ornithological Union, and started a new book on mammals. Meanwhile, Florence tracked bird migrations for him, corresponded about birds and nature, and finally, in her senior year, settled on birds as the topic for her article for the College Science Association. She had been horrified, again, by the growing fashion for women to wear birds, not just their feathers, entire birds, on their hats. She wrote Hart and asked for all the data that he could possibly find on the use of birds and the millinery industry. She told her brother she would form her article essay, Preach, we might say, harangue on the ill effects of women's fashion on bird life. Her essay was so well received that her professor and early mentor in writing, a woman we only know as Miss Jordan, told her that it had encouraged more Smith women to take science. It was excerpted in 2 newspapers, and Miss Jordan prophetically advised her promising young student writer to think about nature writing as a career. In her final semester at Smith, Florence also showed a talent for organizing. She took action after a classmate, catch this, waxed lyrical after having gone and seen a spectacular hat in New York City with 13 bluebirds on it, each with a white collar and a curious top notch. These were kingfishers, striking crested birds that make a rattling call along streams, perch with a memorable profile featuring a large bill and dive spectacularly to catch a fish. So Florence had heard about, from her brother, the formation of a new society, brand new, called the Audubon Society for the Protection of Birds. Florence and her friend Fanny Hardy then organized a mass meeting. Smith College was small then, of 75 students, 5 faculty members, came out, presented papers, discussed the plight of birds. Soon they formed the Smith College Audubon Society, one of the first of its kind. Florence went further. She organized field trips to nearby Mount Tom and brought in famous outside speakers. In this case, John Burroughs, who she had known his work, Wake Robin and others. So despite rain on the appointed day, 30 Smithies followed Burroughs around Mount Tom, and Florence wrote, "The strong influence of his personality and quiet enthusiasm gave just the inspiration that was needed. We all caught the contagion of the woods." So Burroughs, who was quite well known, came back to Smith and went to many other colleges, and so before the web, before email, before social media, you were observing the first environmental grassroots network emerging, being born. Shortly after graduating with the class of 1886 from Smith, Florence wrote in the class letter she'd attended the American Ornithological Union meeting. There she distributed 10,000 Audubon circulars, sent articles to about 15 newspapers, organized 6 local secretaryships, 3 of which are now doing active work, distributed papers in all the neighboring towns, stirred the college girls up to do renewed babble, and wrote letters to everyone I ever heard of. You got a role model, trust me. Then in 1889, Florence published her first book, Birds Through an Opera Glass. It was an instant hit. At age 26, Florence had written not only a book that stressed observing live birds in the field rather than shooting them, it was the first truly popular introduction to birds. Her book has illustrations from Baird and Brewer and Ridgway's History of North American Birds, but believing that the love of birds and nature and the desire to protect them are best learned through experience, Florence offers helpful hints to the observers. She even commends her own German binoculars from Voigtlander und Sohn. Designed to appeal and touch its readers, Birds Through an Opera Glass set off today's near obsession with bird watching. So Rachel Carson's mother must have been aware of Florence's work in St. Nicholas magazine, such as her piece on spring migration that appeared in May 1900, alongside articles by President Roosevelt and the Western nature writer Mary Austin. But Rachel herself would have most likely have known about Florence Bailey's work from the DC Audubon Society and from Florence's many books, especially those on Western birds. Because when Rachel Carson wrote pamphlets for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on then new national wildlife refuges and bird preserves, she thoroughly researched every site that she wrote about, visited them, and when she took a Western trip for firsthand research, she most probably would have consulted Bailey's popular and authoritative Handbook of Birds for the Western United States. I haven't yet found records of whether Rachel actually met Florence Bailey, but it seems quite likely. Rachel was already an active birder when she lived in Baltimore in the late 20s and 30s, when Florence was at the height of her influence and fame. When Rachel Carson later moved to the Washington area in suburban Silver Spring, she became a formal member of the Audubon Naturalist Society, which is the Washington, D.C. Audubon Society, joined its board of directors in 1948. But Florence Merriam Bailey had founded that group years before, served on its board of directors, shown here, and remained a revered member well into her 80s, into Rachel's time, when they at least crossed in 1948, when Florence Merriam Bailey died at home on Kalorama Road in Washington, D.C. So by the early 20th century is where we are. There is already a broad conservation movement going back decades. It's much richer than the sometimes conventional narrative of a few early male leaders and writers like John Muir and Gifford Pinchot, Teddy Roosevelt. And within that movement, women played a substantial role. I should note, too, that Gifford Pinchot also praised the widespread efforts of women in the progressive era in his 1910 book, which is on the final exam, called The Fight for Conservation. And these included campaigns by, catch this, the Daughters of the American Revolution, led by his mother, Mary Eno Pinchot, a wealthy woman who helped set up and fund that other forestry school at the Duke of the North. And she also led 77,000 members of the DAR in conservation campaigns. They had won an internal battle against the conservative wing of the DAR. But that was the progressive era. Perhaps they will return to that tradition. The other campaigns, just to briefly note, at this time, there are so many of them. The Pennsylvania Forestry Association, Minnesota Women Who Preserved National Forests, and California Women, who after a 9-year fight saved the Calaveras big trees. As Carolyn Merchant points out, women had developed organizations in the 19th century that paved the way for the conservation effort. Women's clubs, women's rights, and abolition movements all exposed women to the political process and the public arena. That is what is key, it seems to me. Particularly important was the General Federation of Women's Clubs. We too often deride them, I believe. Founded in 1890, it had been active in forestry since it was active in forestry from the beginning of the century, with cleanup, beautification campaigns, and the purchase of lands for conservation. They had some 800,000 members nationwide, who were kept abreast of Roosevelt's and Pinchot's conservation policies, and state affiliates who took on specific campaigns. Notable among them was the preservation of old-growth forests in California. The California Club, Women's Club, had been founded in 1897 at the home of, again, I only know her name as Mrs. Lowell White of San Francisco, after a failed suffrage campaign, so she turned her energy to saving the forests. In 1900, she and the club took up the cause of forestry, merged with women's clubs throughout the state to form the California Federation of Women's Clubs. A woman named Clara Bradley Burdett became the first president, and this woman happens to look like my grandmother from California from that time, no joke. But she was the first president of the California Federation of Women's Clubs, and in her opening impassioned speech, catch what this lady had to say. While the women of New Jersey are saving the Palisades of the Hudson from utter destruction by men, to whose greedy souls Mount Sinai is only a stone quarry, and the women of Colorado are saving the cliff dwellings and pueblo ruins of their state from vandal destruction, the word comes to the women of California that men whose souls are gang saws are meditating the turning of our world-famous sequoias into planks and fencing worth so many dollars. You go, girl. I mean, who knew this was going on? So today, this tradition of women environmental leaders and writers continues. There are many, many. I chose just to focus a little bit on Sandra Steingraber, who happens to be a friend, colleague of mine. Sandra strongly identifies with Rachel Carson. Sandra is a distinguished scholar at Ithaca College and an activist and advocate. She's also the author of 3 fine environmental books, including ones about the environmental hazards faced by her children, Faith and Elijah. Her books, among others, are called Having Faith and Studying Her Own Womb as an Ecosystem and What Kinds of Contaminants Might or Might Not Come in and Affect Her Child and What to Do About That. And it's so beautifully written that I still recommend it to young women. And she also has another one called Raising Elijah, that's about the environmental hazard faced by her son as he goes off to grad school and grammar school. Oh, we're pushing the kids too hard. Sorry. So there are strong similarities between Rachel Carson and Sandra Steingraber. Am I on my right slides? There we are, and there's her kids. They both grew up in rural, small-town America, Rachel and Sandra. Each watched their hometown horizons in Pennsylvania and Illinois slowly stained and circled around by smokestacks. Both wanted to be writers from an early age, then blended their gift for sinuous sentences and solid science into accessible accounts for the general reader. Sandra earned an MA in creative writing and published poetry before completing her PhD in biology at the University of Michigan. Both Carson and Steingraber taught college biology for a time before full-time careers as authors. Both women bring alive contemporary, controversial concerns with chemicals, cancer, and the environmental causes of disease. Each is actively political. Each serves on environmental advisory boards within the government. Each is part of a wider environmental movement, communicating with colleagues, citizens, and close friends around the nation, even the world. Each is a woman with cancer. In Boston, when Sandra first starts out to trace the possible origins of her own unusual early onset and rare bladder cancer, in her best-known book, Living Downstream, an ecologist looks at cancer and the environment, she joins a militant women's breast cancer march before the popularity of pink ribbons and has a placard placed in her hands, thrust at her, and it reads, "Rachel Carson was right." So she's marching around like this. And Silent Spring, as Sandra says, was her call to arms. Sandra recalls for us that Rachel Carson would tell the story and would thank her friend and fellow birder, Olga Owens Huckins, in Boston for helping to stimulate Silent Spring. You may have heard this, that Olga wrote about the agonizing death of songbirds from aerial spraying, DDT and other chemicals. But Steingraber wants to highlight that Olga Hutchins was not merely some woman concerned about dying robins in her yard, not merely a concerned citizen suddenly appalled. She was also deeply involved in an organized campaign. Much like Rosa Parks was not simply a woman who was tired, who wanted to sit down on that bus. She had been part of an organized NAACP campaign that had tried many times. She did study at the left-wing Highlander School. She was not just a tired lady. And similarly, Olga Huckins, who did write to Rachel Carson, was an organic gardener, an environmental editor and columnist, and a member of the Committee Against Mass Poisoning. She and its members wrote letters to many newspapers in New England and Long Island. They brought lawsuits, were quite polemical. They called this spraying a human rights approach. They took a human rights approach to environmental harm. She considered the spraying undemocratic and probably unconstitutional. But Sandra's important insight for me is that she says when the lawsuit by the Committee Against Mass Poisoning reached the Supreme Court, that is what became a magnet for media attention. That is what caught the eye of the well-known essayist E.B. White, who then interested New Yorker editor William Shawn. White suggested that instead of him, which is what Shawn wanted, that Rachel Carson do a piece. So when Rachel was offered a 3-part 50,000-word serialization in the New Yorker, Silent Spring was indeed born. But Sandra says, in short, environmental activism in the 1950s opened up a critical space in the publishing industry for environmental writing, and that development, as much as the slow accumulation of scientific knowledge, was the genesis of Silent Spring. So if you haven't read her work, Sandra draws beautifully with words. Living Downstream opens with the landscape of central Illinois stretched out before us, its vast sky like a planetarium filled with stars. Science turns to art, paleontology into painting, environmental data into drawings, hospital records, and histology into human forms. Living Downstream is a layperson's guide to environmental health. But imagination is key. We must picture and feel the facts of abstract science. This metaphorical method prepares us to see beneath the facts, to invite the invisible into our lives. English physician William Harvey discovered circulation inside the body in 1628, Steingraber tells us. And she says, something similar goes on with the water around us and far beneath our feet. Harvey discovered a diffuse net of permeable vessels. So too in Illinois, a capillary bed of creeks, streams, forks, tributaries lies over the land. This is only the water that is visible. Under your feet lie pools of groundwater held in shallow aquifers, interbedded lenses of sand and gravel, and in the bedrock valleys of ancient rivers that lie below. One of these is the Mahomet, part of a river system that once ran west across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Thousands of tons of debris deposited by melting glaciers buried the Mahomet, which now flows underground. You can stand in a place in Mason County, Sandra tells us, where the Mahomet once met the Illinois. Here the water is not too far below the surface, so that with heavy downpours, lakes brim up from under the earth and reclaim whole fields and neighborhoods. The same is true of ancient channels of the Mississippi in Tazewell County, Sandra's girlhood home. She says, if you could see through the dirt, imagine the dramatic view you would have. We have instead endless fields of corn and soybeans that feed America, especially in processed foods, from soft drinks to salad dressing. It is the start, says Steingraber, of a human food chain, the molecules of water, earth, and air that rearrange themselves to form these beans and kernels are the molecules that eventually become the tissues of our own bodies. You have eaten food that was grown here. You are the food that is grown here. You are walking on familiar ground. The ground we eat, we quickly understand, is laced with chemicals introduced after World War II. In 1950, less than 10% of cornfields were sprayed with pesticides. Now it is 99%. Fully 89% of Illinois is farmland, and each year, some 54 million pounds of synthetic pesticides are applied to the fields on which Sandra has us walk and imagine the ancient water that lies beneath. So much of what Steingraber tells us about pesticides and cancer was known in Rachel Carson's time, not all, but most. The looming question then is, why do more people not know these facts? Why has relatively little been done about them? Living Downstream, in addition to being a gripping account of personal battles with cancer and a lyrical laying out of the consequences of chemicals, is a diary of democracy in action. As Steingraber researches her book and draws inspiration from Rachel Carson, from the Beinecke Library at Yale to the marshes of Maine, she wants to listen to the voices behind Silent Spring. She ends up thinking about silence. America is a democracy, she says, with guarantees of free speech carved into the heart of our legal system. No one is carried off by secret police at night or passages in books blacked out by a censor's invisible hand. Instead, we have subtle codes of silence, unspoken agreements in the workplace, or of a family secret that everyone knows but does not discuss. She says Rachel Carson was interested in these silences and wanted to interrupt them with her writing. The dangers of DDT and other pesticides had been known and discussed from when they were first synthesized. Rachel's friends and government colleagues were debating about them fiercely as early as 1945 when they saw government research on the dangers of DDT. So when Carson first considered writing a popular article about the problem of pesticides, she approached the Reader's Digest in 1945, and they said, boring. So we had to wait. The data and information, Steingraber says, was not spirited away in the middle of the night. Instead, it remained soundproofed in internal documents, technical journals. Research was sorely underfunded. Government officials turned deaf ears to bearers of bad news. Silence in a democracy is the true subject of Silent Spring. It can be read as an account of how one kind of silence breeds another. Rachel Carson warns, for example, that the failure in Iroquois County, Illinois, in a useless, protracted chemical war against Japanese beetles, accomplished nothing. But it did leave residues of dieldrin, undiscovered, undiscussed, throughout the water and the soil. Such silence cascades through ecosystems. Robins eat poison grubs and worms and die themselves. In Iroquois County, the result, among others, is dead ground squirrels. Dead ground squirrels, their mouths full of dirt, having gnashed at the ground as they died. Perhaps most important is the silence of scientists themselves, their failure to speak out publicly about what they have found. Rachel Carson did not respect such cowardice. She writes to Dorothy Freeman, her close friend, "I told you once that if I kept silent, I could never again listen to a Veery's song without overwhelming self-reproach." Then she quotes Abraham Lincoln, who you know said, "To sin by silence when they should protest makes cowards out of men." It is why we must recall, says Sandra Steingraber, that Rachel Carson was political. In her recalling of our photo of Rachel on Hawk Mountain, Steingraber explains how Carson described more than just migrating hawks in her unfinished essay called Road of the Hawks. She saw the evolution and interconnectedness of the landscape and would have understood the formation of natural gas and methane in the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania. Carson writes, "And always in these Appalachian highlands there are reminders of those ancient seas that more than once lay over all this land. These whitened limestone rocks on which I am sitting were formed under that Paleozoic ocean of the myriad tiny skeletons of creatures that drifted in its waters. These marine inhabitants, when they died," Sandra Steingraber says, "were transformed into gaseous bubbles of methane and then buried through the eons under accumulated weight of silt to form the Marcellus Shale. It is located under thousands of feet of what we would call the earth, but the mining industry calls overburden, the material that lies between the surface and an area of economic interest. To extract methane bubbles from the area of economic interest, the natural gas industry is now blowing up the state of Pennsylvania." Steingraber also notes that according to the Pennsylvania Land Trust Association, drillers in the Marcellus Shale accumulated 1,614 violations of state oil and gas laws just between the years of 2008 and 2010. And in a well blowout near the Punxsutawney Hunting Club in Clearfield County, they sent 35,000 gallons of toxic effluent over the campers in the state forest. Given what fracking is doing to the landscapes of forests, fields, and farms, as well as human health, Steingraber, as do I, believes Rachel Carson surely would have opposed it. She would have supported recent efforts to prevent it and global climate change. This is at a recent rally at the Congress this summer. So Rachel Carson is best remembered for her brilliant writing about the oceans and, of course, for Silent Spring and the dangers of pesticides. But it is her environmental ethic, her promotion of a broad ecological view to include human health and the interconnectedness of all living organisms, and her fearless, bold advocacy and action that marks her legacy. These values draw upon the legacy of the women who went before her. Women who were not afraid to mix their science with human values, with imagination, with emotion, and calls to action. I call on each of you today to join with and extend this long line of leaders. You have been blessed with knowledge and opportunities almost unimaginable to previous generations. Whatever your own interests and talents in history, environmental science, writing, politics and organizing, art and graphic design, business or engineering, public speaking or the production of films, you have gifts that are sorely, sorely needed. I look forward to joining with you in the historic struggle to preserve the environment and human health. I will work with you, I will march with you, I will stand with you as long as I can do it. I hope you will join with me, and I thank you quite seriously for coming out this afternoon and for doing all that you already do and will continue to do for another generation and for all that it takes.